Okay, so to start, you worked on Pilot Field in Buffalo and the updating of Wrigley Field. What knowledge did you take from those projects into your work on Camden Yards?
Well, Pilot Field was it was it was a new building, of course. It was it was in across the street from the Joseph Ellicott uh, Historic District. So we knew it would have to be a sensitive design, and it actually I would hesitate to call it neoclassical. Maybe it's kind of leaned towards postmodernism, but it was designed with the idea in mind that it was going to be sympathetic to the 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 old post office was the most notable building in that Ellicott historic district, and so we worked with a citizens group, a Blue Ribbon panel, to come up with design treatments and setbacks and massing where we could. And so that kind of collaboration, I think, was important for me to understand and to experience. The Wrigley Field work was, I mean, you can't get much more historic than as an architect in my specialty working on Wrigley Field. I mean, there are others, Fenway, of course, and Tiger Stadium, but the Cubs were very interested in. I worked with them from 1983 until, in fact, we just, a few years ago finished their 5-year master plan. But I worked with a guy, their director of, I can't remember, his name was Mark McGuire. He was not the Cardinals hitter, but he had a mantra of it, whatever we do, it needs to look like it has always been there, because he knew that, many fans were coming to see Wrigley Field and to experience that. So they were very protective of the imagery and the architecture that was Wrigley Field. And then after, let's see, the new ownership purchased the team, they decided to go for historic designation. And of course, that brings a whole new set of issues and constraints to work with. But I think that it was, I learned to appreciate the steel, the lightness of a truss as opposed, the Pilot Field project was steel structure, but I would describe it as a bit more modern than what we did at Camden Yards. Camden Yards, of course, the Orioles wanted a very traditional experience. In fact, that was their mantra, that it needed to be a traditional ballpark with all the modern amenities.
Yeah, then in the first place, how did you learn about the Camden Yards project?
Well, that's a long story, but it started when the Colts left Baltimore, and Mayor Schaefer at the time tapped a guy named Henry Buda, to have a task force that would look at what it would take to get an NFL franchise back to Baltimore. So the first thing they asked us to do was to examine modifications, renovations to Memorial Stadium, which we took a few months and came up with, talked to the Orioles, talked to people in the NFL, came up with modifications that we suggested, presented it to the Buda Commission, and it kind of surprised us because we thought we were aimed at a renovation of Memorial. The first thing that Buda asked was, okay, what will we have when you're done with this renovation? And we said, well, maybe a B plus. And then instantly it turned into let's build a new facility downtown. So that was, I mean, at the time when the Colts left, I don't remember the year, but our firm was very prominent in NFL doing renovations. We were also prominent in baseball, obviously, but they reached out to us after the Colts left to do that improvement study, and it just rolled into, okay, now we'll have a site selection process. I remember he was governor by then, I think, Governor Schaefer. There was a press conference, and he announced that we were going to go towards a new facility. And he surprised everyone by saying in the press conference, a live press conference, the way I remember it, he said, and we're going to have a hotline you can call in with suggested sites for this facility. So that turned into, I think there were 98 sites suggested. Some of them were obviously not starters because it was a 4-acre parcel or too small. Some of them were city parks that had restrictive covenants where the land was donated, but if it was ever used for anything else, it would revert to the descendants of the original owners. So we went through a matrix and looked at all 98 sites, ranked them for economic impact, visibility, traffic obviously was important, and there were one or two other criteria, but it came down to the Camden Yards site or the Fort site. I can't remember the name, and so they asked us to recommend a site, and we said, well, if you look at the Camden Yards site versus I'm really struggling to remember the name of the other. It was on the other side of the harbor, and is Fort McHenry right? I'm not sure. At any rate, we said the Camden Yards site has the ability to be massive in terms of economic impact to the community, and so that was the selection that they made. It was also big enough. By then, the Orioles had made their thoughts known. I remember Larry Lucchino. I wasn't at this meeting, but he was at a meeting with the governor and others, and they had the expectation that the Orioles would sign a long-term contract in a multi-purpose stadium. And Lucchino shocked them all by saying, well, we'd sign a series of one-year contracts, but we're not going to sign up to play in a multi-purpose stadium for 25 years, which is what they wanted. So that turned it into the two facilities, the one for the Oriole Park and M&T Bank. I think it's still M&T Bank Stadium for the Ravens. I think I answered your question there. I hope I did.
Yeah, definitely. Was the other site Port Covington?
Port Covington, yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Fort McHenry is still there.
Yeah, so as that process kind of got further along, HOK was one of several firms to interview for the role, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Were you involved with that process at all?
Yes, I was. We had, let's see, we had worked with the Stadium Authority for everything I'd described so far in the site analysis, and they had selected the Camden Yards site, and then they wanted to go through, they said, well, we'll have to go through an interview process. We were invited to interview, I think, SOM, HNTB, it seems like there was another firm and us, or maybe there was just the three of us. So we interviewed and were selected. So the MSA had agreed with the Orioles that they would have design direction control. And so that then turned into a series of sessions to understand what the Orioles wanted and what would fit the MSA's budget. So there was hope I'm not talking out of school here, but there was a famous meeting. So we told the MSA, we need to meet with the Orioles, discuss this program, flesh it out, because there are things that weren't even mentioned in that program, like the width of the concourses. It just said that there will be concourses. And so we needed to understand what we needed to build, what we needed to design to become built. And so the MSA said, okay, well, we'll schedule a meeting next week with the Orioles. The Orioles came with their attorneys, the MSA came with their attorneys, and we were talking about the club and suite level. And the two sides' attorneys got into a conversation, or debate, if you will, about, it was a ridiculous thing at that stage to debate. It's what the program says is that one wall of the toilets on the club level would have tile to a certain height. Now, I don't know why that was in that program, but they got to debating about it, and this went on for a few minutes, and one of our guys finally said, okay, I see, you're charging $350 an hour, you're charging $350 an hour, and there's 4 other attorneys here. I'm pretty sure we could have paid for the tile if you didn't bill the clients for this argument. So that changed the tenor of these meetings. They decided that we needed to work through it with the Orioles, and the Orioles and the MSA agreed that just the team executives, just the MSA executive, who was Bruce Hoffman, and ourselves would meet and talk.
Do you remember the first time you met Larry Lucchino?
Yeah, it would have been during the Hank Buda work. We met with the Orioles quite a few times, and Larry obviously was there during that process. We actually had reviewed the program, that outline program, with the team executives during the work we did before the interview. So it would have been 2 years or so before we were even hired to actually do the project.
Yeah, Larry's talked about how classic parks like Forbes Field and others inspired him. Did he ever talk with you about that and how that kind of inspired his vision for Camden Yards?
Very much so. Very much so. He in fact, he was very interested in an authentic, traditional baseball park. He actually at one point asked if we could put columns in the lower deck to get the upper deck closer. He was very, very, very focused on it being an intimate ballpark like he remembered from Forbes Field and some of the others. And, but the realities are, he wanted, they needed all of the bells and whistles, suites, club seats, concession stands, that weren't that much of a factor when places like Forbes Field were designed and built. So I remember at one point there was a conversation, I can't remember, Governor Schaefer thought that, he didn't see the logic of compromising valuable seats in the lower deck by having columns a la Fenway or Wrigley. And he made his thoughts clear. And so we stopped Larry stopped talking about that. I don't say that to denigrate anything Larry did. He was very focused on what he wanted. He wanted it to be like ballparks used to be, and that was his focus. So, but he was also pragmatic, and he knew that they needed suites and they needed the lower deck seats. I remember there was a bunch of press that was attributed to a guy from Chicago who advocated for. Now his premise was HOK is compromising the proximity of the upper decks of their new ballparks to get the suites and club seats closer. So I remember I was interviewed on NPR, and it was Terry Gross asked me about that, and I said, well, that's not really why we don't put columns in the lower deck. It's to preserve the sight lines from the people in the back third of the lower deck. So, yeah, I mean, we could put columns and get the suites closer, but then the upper deck would be too steep, because the closer you move an upper deck to the focal point, the steeper it has to become. So, it's an apple and an orange to look at a ballpark like Wrigley and Fenway compared to Camden Yards. Camden Yards was a very powerful economic driver for the Orioles.
Yeah, Janet Marie Smith worked closely with Larry, but
Yes.
their roles were differently. Can you kind of, their roles were different? Can you kind of help me understand like their respective roles?
Well, Janet was actually pretty valuable to us because she came on, I think she joined the project after we had started schematic design. But it was really valuable to us because she would meet with Larry and the other team executives, the general manager and the grounds crew, and then she was able to come to us and say, well, I had 2 meetings last week with these guys, and this is what they want for the grounds crew. This is what they want for the clubhouse. And so that actually was pretty valuable to us, that she would do that, because they would debate with each other. Bob would say something and Larry would say, no, Bob, you're not thinking about this in the right way. So all of that happened in meetings with Janet after she was on board, and then she could get them to agree to a direction, and she could give it to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned it earlier that the decision to keep the warehouse wasn't necessarily unanimous, wasn't always the plan. What was kind of your personal opinion about it?
Oh, I thought it was great. We actually went through a master plan session with RTKL and Wallace Robertson Todd. So the 3 firms, HOK, Wallace Robertson Todd, and RTKL, were involved in the master plan. And it just became clear during that process to everyone that the warehouse was an icon to be respected. And so that, when we actually started the work for real on the project, that was when, for example, our concept, of removing part of it was not the way to go. And so there was a study. I remember the Orioles were skeptical about retaining the warehouse. There was a writer for the Baltimore Sun who was adamantly opposed to the warehouse. He wrote articles that basically said, well, Governor Schaefer is being misled about the value of keeping the warehouse. It's a pile of old bricks. should be demolished. And so the MSA, of course, was interested in this question also. Okay, if we save this warehouse, will we spend, $50 million to renovate it, or is it structurally sound, or all sorts of questions. And the great thing about it being a warehouse was that nothing was hidden. It was a heavy timber structure inside, masonry brick bearing walls outside. You could see the structure, and you could, so we had our engineers look at it, and they came back and said, "No, you don't have any structural issues here. You don't have any MEP issues because there really aren't any MEP systems in that building. Yeah, there's lights for electricity, but you're not going to find you're not going to find asbestos, for example. That was a big item of concern at the time because it was never insulated. So it turned into I think it was a 30-day study, and we actually suggested, in fact, in our concept work for the Orioles, we suggested that some of the ballpark spaces could be placed into the warehouse, like the concessionaire commissary, the team offices, the stadium club, MSA offices. That was all space that was already existing. In fact, there was more space available than the program called for. So that allowed us to build, to not have to build those as part of the ballpark. There was conversation about making the wall of the warehouse be the outfield wall. And we didn't like that idea. Thankfully, there was, being that Utah corridor was a street, there was a ton of city utilities in under that street that would have had to have been relocated at a huge cost. So it was pretty clear that the Utah corridor was going to stay basically where it was. And it has become, as you just said, one of the icons. I mean, I remember Janet called it the third inning cruise. So people get restless in the third inning if it's not a close game, or if it's, if they just need to stretch their legs. It's a place to go and see and be seen. I would tell future clients, most important decision is the site. Well, most important decision is pick us. The second most important decision is the site, because everything we're going to do for you, you're going to be involved, but everything we're going to do for you is going to be about that site, about your community. It has to be, otherwise it could be a McDonald's franchise somewhere.